When a woman hurts you, the first and most dangerous mistake you can make is allowing her actions to become a judgment about who you are. Pain has a way of collapsing perspective. It narrows your thinking until the hurt feels personal, permanent, and defining. But Stoic wisdom begins precisely at this point, by separating what happened from what it means about you. Another person's behavior is an expression of their character, their emotional capacity, their limitations, and their choices in a specific moment. It is not a measurement of your worth. When you confuse those two things, you surrender control over your identity. You allow someone else's actions to dictate your internal state, and that is where suffering multiplies. The Stoics were clear on this. Events themselves do not wound us. Our judgments about them do. The pain you feel may be real, but the story you attach to it is optional. When you tell yourself that being hurt means you were weak, inadequate, or disposable, you deepen the wound unnecessarily. You turn an experience into a verdict. It's important to understand this distinction clearly. You can acknowledge that what happened was painful without turning that pain into self-condemnation. Feeling hurt does not mean you failed. It means you cared. And caring is not a flaw. It is only dangerous when it is paired with misplaced self-blame. In relationships, especially emotional ones, people often project their unresolved conflicts onto others. They act from fear, insecurity, confusion, or emotional immaturity. When someone lashes out, withdraws, betrays, or dismisses you, it is rarely a calculated evaluation of your worth. It is far more often a reflection of their internal chaos. But if you internalize their behavior as a reflection of your value, you carry a burden that was never yours. Stoicism teaches restraint at the level of interpretation, not denial, not emotional suppression, restraint. You observe what happened without exaggeration. You say, "This person chose to act this way, not this happened because I am lacking." That small shift protects your sense of self from being hijacked by someone else's emotional state. This is where dignity begins, not in pretending you are unaffected, but in refusing to let pain define you. When you maintain this separation, you stop chasing validation from the very source that caused the harm. You stop asking questions that have no satisfying answers. You stop replaying conversations in search of a version where you were enough to prevent the outcome. You are always enough to act with integrity. What others do with that integrity is outside your control. There is also strength in recognizing that being hurt does not make you powerless. The only real loss occurs when you let the experience reshape your self-image in a negative way. If you emerge from pain believing you are less worthy, less capable of love, or fundamentally flawed, then the damage continues long after the relationship ends. But if you preserve your identity, the pain becomes temporary rather than transformative. Stoic discipline asks you to place your self-worth on something stable. Your values, your actions, your character, those are within your control. Another person's feelings, loyalty, or emotional clarity are not. When you anchor your identity internally, external rejection loses its ability to define you. This does not mean excusing harmful behavior, it means refusing to absorb it. You can acknowledge that someone hurt you and still recognize that their actions do not diminish who you are. That clarity is what allows you to move forward without resentment or desperation. When you separate her actions from your identity, you reclaim your agency. You stop reacting and start choosing. You choose how much meaning the event will have. You choose whether it becomes a lesson or a scar. And that choice determines whether you grow stronger or remain stuck. Pain does not get to decide who you are. You do. One of the hardest lessons after being hurt is accepting what you cannot control, especially when that thing is another human being. The mind resists this truth because it feels like surrender. You replay conversations, imagine different outcomes, and search for the precise combination of words or actions that might have changed her behavior. But Stoic wisdom begins where this resistance ends. Peace starts when you recognize that other people's choices were never under your command. You cannot control her feelings, her loyalty, her emotional maturity, or her willingness to treat you with care. You never could. Believing otherwise creates an illusion of power that collapses the moment reality asserts itself. When that illusion breaks, the pain feels sharper than it needs to be, because it carries disappointment not just in her, but in the false sense of control you thought you had. Acceptance does not mean approval. It does not mean saying what happened was acceptable or deserved. It means acknowledging reality without fighting it. Stoicism teaches that suffering increases when we demand that reality be different from what it is. You may want her to understand you, to regret what she did, or to choose you differently. But wanting does not create control. It only creates attachment to an outcome you cannot guarantee. This is where many people get stuck. They confuse acceptance with weakness. They believe that letting go means losing dignity. In truth, the opposite is happening. The moment you stop trying to control what is uncontrollable, you regain control over yourself. Your energy returns to where it belongs, your thoughts, your actions, your direction. People act according to their own nature, experiences, fears, and limitations. Expecting someone to behave outside of that is like expecting fire not to burn. You may wish it were otherwise, but wishing does not change the properties of reality. Stoicism asks you to align your expectations with how people actually behave, not how you hope they might. When you accept that her actions were the result of her inner world, you stop personalizing them. You stop asking why you weren't enough to make her choose differently. That question assumes you had power over something you never controlled. It places responsibility where it does not belong. And carrying that responsibility exhausts you, emotionally. Acceptance also releases you from the endless need for explanations. You may never fully understand why she hurt you. Even if she explained herself, it might not satisfy you. People often do not understand their own motives clearly. Waiting for clarity from someone who caused confusion keeps you tied to the source of pain. Stoicism teaches you to cut that cord. This does not mean suppressing emotion. It means letting emotion pass without allowing it to dictate your behavior. You can feel sadness, anger, or disappointment while still choosing not to act from those states. You can acknowledge loss without chasing resolution from someone unwilling or unable to give it. The desire to control outcomes often disguises itself as hope. You tell yourself that if you wait, if you remain available, if you prove your worth, things might change. But hope that depends on another person's transformation is fragile. It places your peace in someone else's hands. Acceptance, on the other hand, is grounded. It allows you to move forward based on what is, not what might be. When you fully accept that you cannot control her choices, something important shifts. You stop negotiating with reality. You stop bargaining with the past. You stop asking questions that have no productive answers. Instead, you ask better questions. What is within my control now? How do I respond with dignity? What kind of person do I choose to be after this? This shift is not passive. It is disciplined. It requires daily restraint, resisting the urge to reach out, to explain, to convince, to reopen wounds. Each time you choose acceptance over control, you strengthen your emotional independence. You prove to yourself that your stability does not depend on someone else's behavior. Stoicism does not promise comfort. It promises clarity. And clarity brings a quieter, more durable form of peace. When you accept what you cannot control, you stop fighting reality and start shaping your own character. And that is where real strength begins. One of the most subtle traps after being hurt is the pursuit of closure. The mind convinces you that peace lies somewhere in a final conversation, a clear explanation, or a sincere apology. You tell yourself that if you could just understand why she did what she did, the pain would loosen its grip. But Stoic thinking challenges this belief directly. It asks a difficult question. What if the closure you are waiting for is something she is unable or unwilling to give? When you seek closure from the person who hurt you, you place your emotional resolution in their hands. You depend on their honesty, self-awareness, and compassion. That is a fragile position to occupy, especially when the injury itself proves that those qualities may already be lacking. Waiting for someone else to complete your healing keeps you psychologically tethered to them long after the relationship has ended. The desire for closure often disguises itself as reason. It feels mature to want explanations. It feels fair to want answers. But underneath that desire is often resistance to accepting reality as it stands. You are not actually seeking information, you are seeking relief. And relief does not come from answers alone, it comes from acceptance. Stoicism teaches that you must finish what others leave incomplete, not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. People do not always provide clean endings. They leave confusion, mixed signals, and unanswered questions. If you insist on understanding everything before moving on, you grant them ongoing influence over your emotional state. Internal closure removes that influence. This begins with recognizing that explanations are not always truthful, even when they are offered. People explain themselves in ways that protect their self-image. They minimize, justify, or rationalize their actions. Even sincere explanations can be incomplete, because people often do not fully understand their own motives. Building your peace on someone else's narrative is unstable. Instead, Stoicism invites you to construct a simpler, more reliable conclusion, something grounded in observable reality rather than interpretation. The reality is this: she chose actions that caused harm. Whether through intention, carelessness, or incapacity, the result was the same. That fact alone is sufficient to justify your decision to move forward. Internal closure does not require certainty about her motives. It requires certainty about your boundaries. It means saying, "This experience has shown me enough." Enough to stop chasing clarity from confusion. Enough to stop reopening wounds in the hope of a better ending. Enough to choose peace over prolonged attachment. There is also dignity in refusing to beg for understanding. When you pursue closure externally, you often find yourself over-explaining, defending your feelings, or trying to be seen. That dynamic erodes self-respect. Internal closure restores it by shifting the focus from being understood by her to understanding yourself. This process is not instant. The mind will return to unanswered questions again and again. Each time it does, Stoicism asks you to gently redirect it, not with suppression, but with discipline. You remind yourself that clarity does not require her participation. You remind yourself that peace does not depend on agreement. You remind yourself that moving on is an act of strength, not avoidance. Creating internal closure also involves releasing the fantasy of a different version of her. Often you are not attached to who she actually was, but to who you hoped she would become. Letting go of that imagined future can be more painful than letting go of the person. But fantasies cannot be resolved through conversation. They can only be released through acceptance. When you stop chasing closure, something unexpected happens. The emotional noise begins to fade. You are no longer waiting. You are no longer checking. You are no longer mentally rehearsing conversations that will never occur. Your attention returns to the present moment where your life is actually unfolding. Stoicism does not deny the need for meaning. It simply teaches you to create meaning where it is available. The meaning here is not in her explanation, but in your response, in how you choose to interpret the experience, in how you decide to carry it forward. You may never get the answers you want, but you can always choose the ending you need, and that choice is where freedom begins. Pain, when left unattended, has a tendency to rot into bitterness. That bitterness feels justified at first. It tells you that your anger is proof of self-respect, that resentment protects you from being hurt again. But Stoic wisdom warns against this illusion. Bitterness does not protect you. It binds you. It keeps you emotionally anchored to the very experience you claim to want to escape. Discipline, on the other hand, transforms pain into something usable. When a woman hurts you, there is a surge of energy that follows. Anger, sadness, humiliation, and confusion all arrive at once. That energy must go somewhere. If it is not directed, it will leak into destructive patterns. Obsessing, revenge fantasies, impulsive decisions, self-neglect, or emotional withdrawal. Stoicism does not ask you to deny this energy. It asks you to command it. Discipline is the act of giving pain a direction. Instead of allowing suffering to harden you, you refine yourself through it. You channel emotional chaos into structure. You turn heartbreak into clarity. This does not happen automatically. It requires conscious effort, repeated daily, especially when emotions are loudest. Bitterness feels easier because it requires no effort. You simply replay the injury and let resentment reinforce itself. Discipline is harder because it demands restraint. It asks you to pause before reacting. It asks you to act according to values rather than emotion. But only one of these paths leads to freedom. Stoic thinkers understood that suffering is inevitable, but corruption of character is optional. Pain tests you. It asks whether you will allow circumstances to shape your temperament or whether you will shape your response to circumstances. Discipline is the decision to remain sovereign over yourself when everything in you wants to surrender control. This discipline shows itself in small, unglamorous choices. You wake up and choose routine instead of rumination. You choose physical exertion instead of emotional stagnation. You choose silence instead of impulsive messages. You choose self-respect instead of self-pity. None of these choices erase pain immediately, but together they prevent pain from defining you. There is also discipline in thought. When bitterness arises, you examine it rather than indulge it. You ask whether it is useful, whether it strengthens you, whether it aligns with the kind of person you intend to become. Most resentment collapses under honest inspection. It promises relief but delivers stagnation. Transforming pain into discipline also means extracting lessons without turning them into weapons. You learn where boundaries were ignored. You learn where judgment was clouded by desire. You learn where standards were compromised. But you do not use these lessons to justify cynicism. You use them to improve discernment. Stoicism is not about emotional numbness. It is about emotional mastery. You allow yourself to feel, but you do not allow feeling to rule. You understand that pain can be instructive without being destructive. It can sharpen you rather than scar you. One of the most powerful shifts occurs when you stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and begin asking, "How will I respond to this?" The first question keeps you trapped in the past. The second places you in command of the future. Discipline lives in that second question. Bitterness narrows your world. It convinces you that people cannot be trusted, that vulnerability is foolish, that detachment is safety. Discipline expands your world by restoring confidence in your own judgment. You realize that the lesson was not that love is dangerous, but that unexamined attachment is. As you transform pain into discipline, something subtle changes. You become quieter, steadier, more deliberate. You are no longer driven by the need to prove, punish, or protect your ego. You are guided by self-command, that is strength in its purest form. Pain will visit every life. Not everyone uses it wisely. You can. When you are hurt, the instinct to react is immediate. You want to explain yourself, to be understood, to defend your pain, or to make the other person feel what you feel. Anger urges you to confront. Pride urges you to prove something. Pain urges you to stay connected, even if the connection is damaging. Stoic wisdom asks you to do something far more difficult and far more powerful. Withdraw your attention without hostility, without drama, and without bitterness. Attention is currency. Where you place it determines what grows in your life. When someone hurts you and you continue to give them emotional access, through messages, arguments, explanations, or silent resentment, you keep the wound open. You may call it closure, honesty, or standing your ground, but often it is attachment worry. A different mask. Stoicism teaches that dignity begins when you recognize when engagement no longer serves your character. Withdrawing attention is not punishment. It is not manipulation. It is not an attempt to provoke regret or remorse. The moment your silence is designed to get a reaction, it stops being dignified and becomes strategic. Stoic withdrawal is internal first. It is the decision to stop offering emotional energy to someone who has shown they cannot handle it responsibly. Anger feels justified, but it is loud and revealing. It exposes how deeply you are still affected. Dignity is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not need to be witnessed to be real. When you withdraw calmly, you reclaim your emotional authority. You are no longer reacting to her behavior. You are responding according to your values. This restraint is often misunderstood. People mistake it for weakness or avoidance. In reality, it requires far more strength than confrontation. It is easy to send a message. It is easy to argue. It is easy to demand explanations. It is much harder to sit with discomfort without acting on it. That is discipline in its most refined form. Stoicism does not ask you to suppress your feelings. It asks you to govern them. You acknowledge the urge to speak, to reach out, to reopen the story, and you choose not to. Not because you are afraid, but because you respect yourself enough to know when continued engagement degrades you. There is also clarity in silence. When you remove your attention, the situation reveals itself without interference. You see whether the other person reaches out with sincerity or remains absent. You see whether their concern was real or conditional. Silence strips away illusions because it removes the noise of emotional negotiation. Withdrawing attention also protects you from saying things you cannot take back. Pain-driven communication often leaves a residue of regret. Words spoken from wounded pride rarely reflect your best self. Stoic restraint ensures that when you do speak, if you ever choose to, your words are measured, calm, and aligned with who you want to be. This approach restores balance. Instead of chasing respect, you embody it. Instead of demanding understanding, you practice self-understanding. Instead of seeking power through reaction, you hold power through composure. Over time, this shifts how you see yourself. You begin to trust your ability to endure discomfort without collapsing into impulse. There is also an important boundary being drawn. By withdrawing attention calmly, you communicate to yourself first that access to you is earned through consistency, respect, and care. You do not need to announce this boundary. You live it, and lived boundaries are far more effective than spoken ones. Stoicism recognizes that not every ending requires confrontation. Some endings require distance, some require silence, not as avoidance, but as acceptance. You accept that continuing the interaction would cost you more than it would give. That acceptance frees you from the need to justify your departure. As time passes, the emotional charge weakens. What once felt unbearable becomes manageable. You are no longer pulled back into the same mental loops. Your attention returns to your own life, your work, your health, your purpose. This is not indifference, it is recovery. Why? Throwing attention with dignity does not mean you harden your heart. It means you protect it. You choose not to bleed where no healing is possible. You conserve yourself for relationships that can meet you with the same care you offer. Silence, when chosen consciously, is not emptiness. It is strength. After being hurt, the instinct to protect yourself often swings too far. You tell yourself that you will never feel that way again, never trust that deeply again, never risk being wounded again. This response is understandable, but it is also dangerous. Emotional armor may feel like strength, yet it slowly isolates you. Stoic wisdom does not teach avoidance of pain through withdrawal from life. It teaches advancement through discernment. There is an important difference between wisdom and fear. Fear closes, wisdom clarifies. When you harden yourself emotionally, you are not becoming stronger, you are becoming narrower. You reduce your capacity for connection in the name of safety. Stoicism does not ask you to shut down your heart. It asks you to refine your standards so that your heart is given where it can be respected. Being hurt should not teach you that love is reckless. It should teach you that choice matters, that discernment matters, that character matters. The lesson is not to build walls, but to build criteria. Emotional armor says no one gets in. Standards say only the right people get access. Raising your standards is an internal recalibration. You reflect honestly on what you tolerated, what you overlooked, and what you rationalized. Not to shame yourself, but to sharpen your judgment. You ask better questions next time. You observe behavior more closely. You listen to patterns instead of promises. This is not cynicism, it is clarity. Stoicism encourages learning without resentment. You do not carry bitterness forward as a shield. Bitterness distorts perception. It makes you suspicious of sincerity and blind to goodness. Standards, by contrast, are clean. They are unemotional. They are based on values rather than reactions. You decide what behavior you will no longer excuse, not because you are angry, but because you respect yourself. There is also humility in this process. You acknowledge that you may have ignored warning signs because of desire, hope, or attachment. You take responsibility for your choices without condemning yourself. That balance is crucial. Responsibility without self-hatred leads to growth. Responsibility with self-hatred leads to withdrawal. Moving forward with standards means you no longer negotiate your boundaries to preserve connection. You do not lower expectations to avoid discomfort. You allow people to reveal who they are over time, and you respond accordingly. If someone cannot meet your standards, you do not argue them into place. You accept the information and adjust your involvement. This approach requires patience. Emotional armor offers immediate relief. Standards require restraint. They ask you to slow down, to observe, to wait. But patience is a form of confidence. It signals that you do not need to rush intimacy to feel complete. You trust your ability to walk away if alignment is missing. Stoicism also teaches that standards must be lived, not announced. You do not lecture others on how to treat you. You demonstrate it through consistency. When boundaries are crossed, you respond calmly. When values are violated, you disengage without drama. Over time, this creates a life that filters itself. Importantly, moving forward with standards keeps you open to genuine connection. You are not guarded by fear, you are guided by principle. You can still feel deeply, care sincerely, and commit fully, but only when those feelings are met with reciprocity and respect. This is strength without rigidity. Emotional armor makes every interaction defensive. Standards make interactions intentional. One keeps you surviving, the other allows you to live fully without self-betrayal. Stoicism is not about closing yourself off from love. It is about entering love with your eyes open, your values intact, and your self-respect unnegotiable. That is how you move forward without losing yourself.